I'll say this one time, and I invite you to respond, Happy New Year. It's great to see everybody here this morning. I think most of us are a little sleepier than usual. We were at a gathering last night, and it was getting to be about 11:30, and it suddenly occurred to me I had to preach in the morning. So anyway, glad to be here with you today. As you think over the last year, 2022, I'm curious what you would think about the year as a whole. Would you think of it as a really good year for you and your family? Would you think of it as an especially hard year for you and your family? My guess is that most of us would probably have some mixed feelings, don't you think? There's some things that were really good about the year, maybe, and some things that were really challenging about the year. It's also my personal theory that we tend to view years in hindsight a little more favorably than we do when we're kind of in the middle of them. You know, we can talk about this recent year and say, wow, there was some stuff that was really hard. But if we think about, say, 2015, 2016, we would say, well, those are the good old years. Those are the easy years. But I bet coming right out of those years, you would have probably said similar things about them. I think if there were any year in recent memory for me that many people wanted to characterize as just a terrible year, it would probably be, like Kerwin was alluding to, 2020. When the pandemic was setting in and everything was shutting down and kids were getting isolated from each other and schools were not meeting in person and everything was going to Zoom and the world was in chaos and nobody knew what was happening. A lot of people would talk about 2020 as like this year they just wish they could erase from their life's experience. But as I was thinking about that, 2020 was also the year that we welcomed our first child. And even as we were there hunkered down in our house and locked up and doing only curbside groceries and not having any human contact with anyone, we were also having one of the most joyful seasons of our life. Years are kind of mixed. There's good things and there's challenging things. So whether it's been an easy year for you or a hard year for you, I'm a person who always values at the end of one year and the beginning of a next year, I think it's valuable to pull back, to be introspective, to think about the kind of person that you are currently, to think about the kind of person that you're trying to become, and to do a little bit of tweaking and refocusing and recalibrating. And I'd say, a lot of people will say, I don't really do New Year's resolutions because I never managed to keep them all. And I would say, I don't think the point of setting goals for yourself is that you believe you can perfectly achieve all of them. I think the value of setting goals is that you've pulled back and said, here's the kind of person that I'm trying to be. Here's the intention that I'm going to live with about where I'm trying to get from here. Here are some of the ways I'm going to try and be increasingly open to God's role in my life in shaping me. Do I expect I'm going to meet all my goals? Well, of course not. But I do think I'm better for having tried and having been intentional about it. So as you think about the last year, maybe you find yourself in a place of relative strength compared to where you had been in past years. Maybe it was an especially hard year for you. But as we're closing one year and beginning the next year, I wanted to spend some time this morning with you looking at the book of Lamentations. Now, in Israel's history, Lamentations represents the absolute bottom of the barrel experience. Things were the worst they had ever been. It was terrible. It was even worse than Egyptian slavery because at least when they became slaves, they hadn't really lost anything. They hadn't had any land. But here in Lamentations, this is where they had been a kingdom. They'd had their territory. They'd conquered their foes and their enemies. God had driven them out. And they got the kingdom, and they basically made every possible mistake and got everything wrong. And the full weight of all the promises of God we see throughout the Old Testament, it all came crashing down on them when they were so morally bankrupt. They had become just as bad as the very people God had driven out before them. And so God let them meet the consequences of their actions. They were conquered, they were dominated, they lost their territory. Worst of all for them, they lost their temple. The temple's destroyed, which for them, how do you worship apart from your connection to the temple? It functionally meant as if there were no connection to God at all. They had to rethink everything. How do I worship God in the absence of a temple, of a place that we can gather, and much less when we've been scattered throughout the nations with no permission to travel or go anywhere? It was a devastating, devastating time in their history. And Lamentations is a collection of poems that reflects them at their absolute lowest moments. And one of the worst parts of all of it that you'll see sprinkled throughout the book is their admission, their willing admission that they had contributed to their own plight. They thought they were scheming, they thought they were making plans, but they discovered that they were the victims of all their own devices. They knew that they had only themselves to blame for so much of what was now happening. I want to look at just a few verses to give you some samples of the kind of place that they were in mentally, emotionally, socially, as a nation at the time of this writing. You could start in Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 3. Judah. This was the remaining southern kingdom. The northern kingdom had been conquered years ago. The southern kingdom of Judah was all that had remained. Judah had gone into exile, following affliction and harsh slavery. She lives among the nations, but finds no place to rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in narrow places. In narrow places. You think about the claustrophobia of being pursued, having fewer and fewer places to run, and ultimately being found and conquered and captured with nowhere left to hide. In verse 5, her adversaries have become her masters. Our nightmares are true. The people who opposed us now own us. Her enemies are at ease, for the Lord has made her suffer because of her many transgressions. Her children have gone away as captives before the adversary. Down in verse 20, this is a hard passage. Look, see how I am in distress. I am churning within. My heart is broken, for I have been very rebellious. Outside, the sword takes the children. Inside, there's death. It's a hopeless, hopeless portrayal. And even though we would peer ahead to the end of the book looking for something to get different, chapter 5, we find more of the same kinds of things waiting for us, scattered throughout this book in all the 5 poems. I want to read to you a section of chapter 5. This one to me is another very heavy passage. Listen to this imagery. Our skin is as hot as an oven from the ravages of hunger. Women are raped in Zion. Girls in the cities of Judah. Princes are hung up by their hands. Elders are shown no respect. Young men labor at millstones. Boys stumble under loads of wood. The elders have left the city gate. The young men, their music, it's all silent. There's no singing anymore. Joy has left our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. They're embracing this hard truth that when we live selfishly, we are ultimately the victims of our own devices and our own schemes. The shortcuts we believe we're taking in morality ultimately lead us to the edge of a cliff. It isn't safe to take moral shortcuts. It isn't safe to cut God out of your life. But here they are in this circumstance where they've done all the wrong things they could do, and now they're faced with the consequences of their choices. So those are some very hard passages, and frankly, that's just a small sampling. I could really depress all of us if we read through that whole book. It's a really difficult read. But we've looked at some hard texts, and I think it is the case that, sometimes the truth sits on our shoulder kind of like a petty songbird, like a bird that keeps singing to you this melody that you really don't want to listen to. Again and again, when you're confronted with the truth of the consequences of your choice, I know I did wrong. I know this was my fault. I know this is why this is happening. I know this is what's going on. But the truth is there, and it continues to bellow out that song of what's happened, this constant melody that they didn't want to listen to. And so as we look in Lamentations to see where it is they're going to find hope, part of the way they find hope is actually built into the very structure of this book. Lamentation has 5 songs in it. And each of the 5 is what you would call an acrostic poem. And so what that means is, in fact, if you got your Bibles open, it's kind of interesting to flip through Lamentations because a lot of times your translations will even label the letters of the alphabet. But there's 5 poems that have 22 little sections because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And so a line progressively starts with the letter of the alphabet. So if we did that in English, it means line 1 starts with A, then B, then C. And so you can see in your Bibles, perhaps you've got Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion, and so on and so forth. But you have these 5 poems, and the first 2 and the last 2 have 22 verses following the 22 letters of the alphabet. But chapter 3 is different. Chapter 3 is different. Chapter 3 actually has 3 lines for each letter of the alphabet. And so when the ancients deal with things that are symmetrical, they're usually trying to make some specific point by the symmetry that exists. And so when you look at the shape of this book, you can think about the middle part as if it's kind of the bullseye. It's kind of the main points. It's the piece that they'd say, if you can only take away one thing from any of this, here's the part that you should take away. In a similar vein, we could talk about Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2 is another passage that has symmetry where it says, in yourself have the same mindset that Jesus did, where he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he humbled himself and took on the form of a servant, even to the point of death on a cross. And because of death on the cross, God elevated him and placed him at the highest place and gave him the name above all names. And you can kind of watch this movement to the downward point and back out again. But it's the downward point, it's the cross that's the centerpiece of everything. Lamentations is shaped that way, where we get to the third of these poems. It's the biggest one. It's given the most importance. And we have to look right at the middle piece of chapter 3. It's right in the middle of chapter 3 that the central point, in the middle of this cesspool of terrible suffering, where is it they're going to find hope to get out of any of this? So when you get to Lamentations chapter 3 in verse 22, this is the real main point, and this is how they're going to address this. And this is what we find. At the bottom of the barrel, at rock bottom of life experience, they say, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. So in this period of difficulty and lament, in this horrible situation, we could ask the question, what is it that helps them turn the corner? What is it that helps them begin to find their way out of it? And interestingly, it's not just the admission of guilt. It is certainly a good thing to look at our lives and take ownership for our choices and what we've done and how our choices may have affected us, but it's not purely a matter of saying, I got myself into this, with some implication that therefore I must get myself out of this. The real turning point is the fact that even as they look at their suffering, they're bringing God into it with them. And to some extent, having to point to God as the reason for it. God withheld his protection. He let us experience the consequence of our choices. And even though we suffer terribly at the hands of our enemies, we know that God had a hand in allowing this to happen. But coupled with that belief is the other belief that if God allowed this to happen, God might also just bring us back out of this again. God is the one who could stop the enemy's hands. He's the one who could bless us again. He's the one who could give us hope once again. So in an otherwise very miserable book, do you know that the word good does not show up until chapter 3? Not a single time do you find the word good. Everything's just bad. Until we remind ourselves that God is with us, even in the middle of the suffering. In verses 25 and 27 is the first time we see the word good used. He says, learning to wait quietly for the Lord. That's actually good for us. When I have no choice but to be silent and patient and wait for the Lord, it's actually good for me to do that. Learning to carry the portion that God has allotted us. Maybe this isn't what I would choose for my life, but if this is what God has given me, with God's help, I will bear it. I will keep walking. And he says, this is difficult, but if this is what God has given us, then God will sustain us. It's good that we can do this. He says, learning from hardship while we're still young, and have chances to make changes. Learning from this hardship, he says, it's actually a good thing. It's even a good thing. There are two great sets of truth that I think Lamentations is trying to wrestle with and to hang on to. On the one hand, it's the reality of what has happened. For us ever to experience any meaningful healing, where there needs to be forgiveness, where there needs to be reconciliation, I believe an essential component of reconciliation and restoration is truth-telling. We actually need to tell the truth about our situation and who we are and what our struggles are and our, and our great need for God and His help. There has to be truth-telling about what the reality is of our life. But the other thing we don't need to let go of is the reality of God's love and compassion. Even as we talk about the seriousness of our sins and their consequences, it's also the reality of God's love and compassion that we can depend on. And so whether I view my hardship as mostly my own doing or something God really just permitted to happen, it's also God who can be the cure for this situation. I think you could say that each of us has a bit of a dominant side and a shadow side. I think every person has what they would consider their dominant side and also kind of a shadow side. And so what I mean by that is you probably have a certain way of being that when you say, I'm in a pretty good headspace, I'm being the kind of person I intend to be, you probably have some strengths you would point toward and say, if you got to know me at my best, this is kind of what I'm like. Maybe you're a person who just excels in showing compassion and thinking of people and being mindful of people. Maybe you're a person who's resourceful and wise and you're a powerful teacher and encourager and edifier. Maybe you're someone who's just good at livening up the room and helping everyone else to feel good for being present. We've all got really positive attributes, and you'd like to say that this is really the dominant side of me. This is the side that I want people to see, and when I'm healthy and I'm right with God, this is what comes out. But we also all have this shadow side where because of the circumstance, because of the hardship, because of what's demanded of me right now, a different part of me has to come out that isn't my favorite side, but is sometimes a necessary side. In the face of wrongdoing, in the face of someone pursuing terrible choices, you don't enjoy confronting someone, but love sometimes demands that you do that. And I think this book of Lamentations is written especially for those who've been experiencing God's own shadow side. When God looks at wrongdoing, as much as we like to say God would just glaze over it all, if you have personally suffered something terrible in your life, you actually do want God to hold people accountable for the choices they've made. If someone has done something very harmful to you, you do want there to be some accountability for what has happened. It's very important for us that God is not just merciful, but also just. That God is going to do what's right, and God is going to settle the scores. And so in this circumstance, because they have sinned so grievously and because God has made promises about what would happen if they did, you see God do the thing that He has to do. He has to let them be accountable. I actually think in chapter 3, verse 33 is one of my favorite verses. That little detail, it says, "For He does not afflict from His heart." When God is forced to hold us accountable, He derives zero pleasure from having to do that. God is not sadistic. God does not enjoy punishment even any more than any of us enjoys punishing our children. Sometimes we do it because we must, and always driven by love. God doesn't afflict from His heart. When it looks like affliction in your life, God's heart isn't in it. He's simply allowing it to happen because of who He is and because He must. That shadow side. So I wanted to talk about Lamentations this morning, not because I assume that everyone here is at a true low point, but because I believe that when we're looking at this group of people who had to let go of every other possible way of trying to make sense of their existence, I think there's wisdom in considering what they found. Because if we see what was a solid foundation for them, we know what is also a solid foundation for us. If this was enough for them to begin rebuilding their life and their community and their family and their culture on, then it's enough for us to continue to build our lives on. So I wanted to look at this kind of least common denominator that carried them through in this passage. I could ask the question, what is God's dominant side? When God is being the God He wants to be, when He's doing the kinds of things that He loves to do, what is God's dominant side? One of the things we see is that God is characterized by His love. His steadfast love that we even sing about. His love never ceases. One of the great things about the love of God is that no matter how much of it you experience or no matter how much of it you give away, it only ever increases. You never exhaust the source of it. It only expands, only welcomes in, only increases. God's love also has the ability to serve as a source of identity for us. 1 John says very importantly that we love God because he first loved us. God's love for me is my starting point. God's love for you is your starting point. Your beginning identity is that you're already God's beloved. It is not the case that because you did these things, God therefore loves you. Because you proved yourself and got it right, God now therefore loves you. Because you're getting everything perfectly handled and you could kind of do it on your own at this point, now God loves you. No, the love of God is a starting point. It's his dominant trait. His steadfast love is something that we can build on and base our identity around as God's beloved. Another great thing that shows up in this text, at the central text in this heavy book, is the mercy of God. God's mercy is unending. It never comes to an end. You never find the limit of it. And this is how we can manage to live with our own shortcomings, sometimes with discipline, setbacks, any hardship that we face that we believe might have even been by God's hand. We know that in the end, mercy is going to win out. And I experienced this ultimately somehow, maybe even mysteriously, for my own good. God's mercy means that for each of us, growth is possible. Because I don't have to get everything right on the first try. And sometimes I can do too much, and sometimes I can do too little. But the mercy of God is a constant that lets me keep asking the question, how can I start today as a different person? How can I be a better person today than I was yesterday? It's new every morning. It's there waiting to greet us each day. The mercy of God which says, you're still breathing, you're still alive, you still have a chance to do something different. Hope is not lost. God's love is our identity, and God's mercy means that growth and new chances for us are always possible. It's a great thing to think about at the end of a year and the beginning of a new year. His mercy already waiting for us here in 2023. And then there is the compassion of God. I appreciate what Dan pointed out this morning in talking about compassion and the value of compassion. It says, though there might be grief, even in my grief, I'm going to experience God's compassion. For Jesus to be called Emmanuel, God with us, when God looks at us in his love and in his mercy, he also sympathizes with us. That he's not just a distant judge, he's a close companion who wants to be with us on our journey and to help us along the path. God is compassionate. We can bet on that. We can build our lives on that. God's compassion can be there to help us and to drive us along the way. I wanted to share this poem with you. I don't even know if I've shared it before. I may have already. This won't be the last time you hear it because it's a favorite of mine. But many years ago, a lady named Minnie Haskins wrote a poem called The Gate of the Year. And I think on a Sunday like today, it's a pretty good time to invoke this one. But to that question, what's the solid foundation that you can actually build your life on? What are the things you can assume are true and reliable in every season in your life? This is what she said. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way. Very insightful, because isn't it often the case that what we really cling for is an ability to know the future? I want to see the light for my path. I want to know exactly what the next step is going to look like and where all of this is headed. Or maybe I just want to cling to what's familiar to me because I'm scared of what's out there in the darkness and what's out there in the unknown, and we want to cling to those things. But I love this reminder that actually the safest thing you can do, the most reliable path you can choose, is not just the one that you can predict accurately, not just the one that's familiar to you, but it's actually whatever path God is leading you on that's better for you than either of those options, safer for you than any other choice you could make. When you put your hand into the hand of the one who holds the future, everything else in your life eventually gets where it is that it needs to go and where it's supposed to be. I like to remind myself sometimes that the hand of God always leads us toward redemption. it always leads us toward redemption. Anytime in Scripture, such as, again, Lamentations being one of the worst case scenarios of what happened to them, even as God allowed them affliction, the purpose of it was to redeem them and to restore them to himself. Again and again and again and again, his mercies are new every morning. And even when there's hardship, God's purpose for the hardship is to draw us once again back to himself, closer to himself. The hand of God always leads us to a place of being redeemed and finding hope once again. It is great to get to start the new year with you here on this Sunday. And one of the things that we have a tradition of doing is just trying to create some space in our worship service where if there's a special prayer request or need or anything that you wanted to share with the congregation, you could come forward and do that. But also just remind you that if you have a prayer request of some sort or just need to talk to someone more confidentially, you can always send us a message using this code on the screen, which is also printed in your bulletins, or just simply grab one of the ministers or elders or anybody that you need to talk to. But if there's some way that we could help you this morning, we would invite you to visit with us while together we stand and sing.